Fundamentally, I believe CVs do not belong in the game at a very base level. Before we get into statistics, before we get into how much damage is dealt, what type of damage is dealt, how they spot, how all these things work, at their most basic core principle, they do not match this video game, okay? CVs do not risk ship HP to impact the battle. Every other ship in the game does. Okay? So, what that means is the CV can go impact the battle in many different ways by dealing damage, spotting, resetting capture zones, taking map control, all that good stuff that you can do to impact the game can all be done without the CV player risking their ability to stay in that match. Every other player in that match, to do anything, to push up, to retreat, to do anything, they're close enough that if they want to impact the battle, like let's say a destroyer going to contest a cap, they are risking their ship's HP to do anything. And that risk is not held by a carrier, because carriers can just sit at the back of the map and not risk their HP pool at all, or risk their ability to continue playing this game in this match, whereas every other player is risking and losing their ability to stay in this match. So that's why, in a very basic way, CVs just don't belong, because they're not risking that. What they're risking is their ammunition. While surface ships do have unlimited ammunition, I would argue it's way more powerful to risk ammunition, not players' ability to stay in that match. That is a very different thing. So that's number one. Number two, CVs can set up a crossfire on the map anywhere at any time. Crossfires are one of the most important parts of this video game. Competitive is literally all about outmaneuvering and outpositioning your opponent. That's why some Kings of the Sea games look incredibly boring, and they go for 20 minutes without really much happening. It's all because it's trying to gain little advantages here and there to outmaneuver and get these crossfires set up to take out a ship. Okay? Surface ships, what they have to do is they have to realize they're slow. They generally go around 30 knots, whereas planes can go several hundred knots. Okay? So surface ships have to plan in advance. They have to hopefully get to their position that they're thinking they can set up a crossfire on time to even catch the enemy off guard. They have to hope that they're not going to get spotted or found out or reacted to. It's a lot of time that it takes to set these things up. Whereas a CV can just decide to go anywhere on the map in a very short amount of time and set up a crossfire. And the reason why I call it a crossfire is CVs have high alpha with the potential to do a lot of damage over time, or dot damage. So any reasonable surface ship wants to dodge that. And I'll get into how to dodge things later. But for now, essentially dodging a CV strike requires you to turn hard rudder and do a massive maneuver to change direction. And this means that if you get caught pushing in, let's say you're angled to the whole enemy team in your battleship, let's say, and you're pushing in, you are trying to keep everyone in front of you. You don't want people to get your side, because that's how you die quickly. But you can have a CV just come out of nowhere and instantly get access to your side and do massive damage to you. So if you want to do that, dodge that CV strike, you have to turn into or away from that CV strike, more than likely. And what that will do is open you up to the, say, 5 ships that are in front of you and give them the broadside. That's what a crossfire is. And this is really bad, because it just gives you the ability as a CV player to set up these incredibly powerful maneuvers that surface ships take several minutes to accomplish in seconds. And the last big thing about these crossfires is a lot of times surface ships can use islands to block certain sides of the map and block the ability for the enemy team to set up a crossfire. But a CV can just fly over these islands, and with arming times and drop timings on CV attacks, it really you really can't block CV drops with most islands in this game. So crossfires are crazy important, and the insane ability for a CV to set these up in seconds is number 2 why I believe they do not belong in this game on a very fundamental level. We're not even talking about damage numbers yet. So let's talk quickly about dodging a CV. Obviously, as we established earlier, it's not reasonable to suggest a surface ship can dodge a CV strike when they're locked in by like 3 to 5 ships. Obviously, they can't just turn broadside to that many number of ships to realistically dodge a CV strike. However, when it's alone, when it's a 1v1 CV versus a surface ship, it is possible to mitigate a lot of the CV's damage, okay? For torpedo planes, for example, obviously the CV drop pattern is to drop your broadside. So you just want to turn into the planes or away from the planes, forcing the CV to drop on your bow or your stern. Pretty simple, very easy to do in a 1v1. But as mentioned, as soon as you're dealing with surface ships in a normal game scenario, it's actually just not possible, because the CV can be on the other side of the map doing his own thing, and then suddenly come to your side and just put up this crossfire on you, and when you're not expecting it. And this is part of the reason this game gets so passive when there's CVs. But I'll talk about the impact on CV games versus non-CV games later. We're just talking about dodging. So to dodge a dive bomber, generally you want them to drop you from your broadside, okay? Because the drop is very oblong or vertical, their goal is to drop from your stern or your bow. They want to hit as many bombs as they can, so your goal is to get them to drop coming from your broadside. Sounds a little complicated, but I'm sure you've seen in these clips the way the bomber reticle looks and how important it is for the CV to drop from behind or in front of the ship. Not too bad to do in a vacuum in a 1v1, but again, against multiple ships in a normal game scenario, not really reasonable. And then rocket planes, it comes down to the specific CV you're facing. CVs have very different rocket drop patterns. Some are vertical, some are horizontal, some are very large, some are very narrow. So it's more on you to learn which drop pattern it is and then to appropriately dodge. So some will obviously want to hit broadsides, some are going to want to hit from the bow or the stern. So it's not too hard to do. I totally agree with people when they say it's not too hard to do, but it's unreasonable to do these maneuvers when you're facing enemy surface ships at the same time. And that's why I don't really take a lot of these arguments seriously that say, oh, you can just dodge. Well, they're not taking a realistic game scenario into account. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about anti-aircraft, okay? It is not designed in this game to completely prevent a strike. Unlike before in the RTS ways when you had defensive fire, that was basically designed to prevent a strike. But right now, AA is designed to guaranteed allow one strike, for the most part, even in somewhat grouped AA. And multiple drops happening almost guaranteed on a lone target. Okay, and this is why flanking is really not allowed in CV games, because a lone target is obviously going to be the target of a CV because they can get multiple drops off from the same squad. This is the biggest problem with AA, is that there's no player control. It's an entirely automated system that doesn't allow for player skill to impact the outcome of shooting down any planes. So in a multiplayer game, in a PvP experience, to leave all this damage output and taking to an automated system feels horrible. And that's the primary reason I think most people hate CVs, is because of this automated system. There's no control in the player's hands in a PvP game. That's the main reason I believe CVs are so hated. And this is the main reason I dislike CVs. Is the just lack of player control and lack of player skill impacting the outcome of the game. So for the surface ship, it feels like there's nothing to learn or get better at. There's nothing to do differently. CV damage simply comes as a tax of existing in a CV game. All you can control is your position, and are therefore encouraged to never push and always clump up in groups of ships at the back of the map. Because clumped AA can sometimes shoot down the planes in time, and if you push in, you're going to be caught in these crossfires like I talked about. So for the player of a surface ship, obviously you're going to play at the back of the map where you have room to maneuver and dodge without getting shot at and almost guaranteed killed by the enemy team because they're so far away. So that's part of the reason this game becomes so passive in a CV game. That's a big deal. The other thing, we also need to think about this from a CV player's perspective. It also feels horrible, the AA feels terrible from a CV perspective, because it's also just an automated mechanic that means he's losing his planes and losing his ammunition, which he does have a finite amount of that slowly regenerate. So for the CV player, it feels awful because some random automated system in a player versus player game is causing him to lose squads, his ammunition, his impact on the battle. And of course, from the surface ship's perspective, it feels horrible because this random AA is not dealing well with the CV strikes, and this random chance stuff is forcing that surface ship player to lose his ship's HP, which again is his tie to stay in that game. So this automated system is horrible. It's terrible. Taking control away from players and just leaving it in this automated system is just so frustrating for both parties. It's not just the surface ship, it's the CV as well. Because there's times when you just get lucky with flat clouds and the CV loses all of his squad before he even gets a drop off. Well, that would feel awful as well, right? It's just a bad system to leave such a massive part of your game not in the player's control in a player versus player scenario. So let's talk about CV spotting. This is a big deal. Spotting is one of the most important parts of this game because you can't really damage anyone you can't see, for the most part. And CVs are able to spot at any time with very, very little effort. You just kind of fly over there. Ships are incredibly slow and have a large detection radius compared to planes, making it harder and a lot more punishing to go spot for your team. And this really ties into my first point, where CVs aren't risking their ability to stay in the match to impact the game. CVs can go spot with their planes for free, and a destroyer, for example, has to risk its HP pool, its tie to the game, to go get that same spotting. Sure, a CV might lose like one plane if they venture into some AA bubble they didn't see, but it's very unlikely that you're going to lose any planes just going and spotting. This means that if a ship needs to die for your team to win or have a better chance at winning, it's entirely possible to YOLO planes into a group of enemy ships to spot like a low HP destroyer, for example. And you can just pretty much guaranteed kill him with that spotting, even if you don't get your drop off and your team is ready to shoot him. This isn't possible with a surface ship outside of radar, but radar has a set range, and a surface ship has to risk its ability to stay in the game, risking its HP, to get in a good spot to get that radar off. A CV can just YOLO some planes in and accomplish the same thing, even better than that, because they can get a very accurate drop-off right on top of the ship, as well as getting some good spotting for their team, which is pretty crazy. This also means that resetting cap circles is basically guaranteed outside of a smokescreen, because the CV can spot and deal damage all for himself. The other big issue with CV spotting, that in my mind, is you get instant knowledge of where the enemy team is deploying at the very start of the game. It entirely removes the tension and the thought of what is the enemy team going to do, where are they going to deploy, where is that name X ship, let's say it's a radar ship, or it's a very stealthy high impact ship, or something like that, where are they going to deploy? It removes all of that guessing out of the game. It removes that dynamic of the game. Any surprises, any ships that rely on stealth to be effective, just totally removes it. It takes a lot of complexity out of the game. And I don't think that's a very good thing. Now, let's talk about damage. I'm going to say most of the damage in this game is somewhat healable, okay? There's very few things that are not very healable, namely being citadels and torpedoes from surface ships, okay? But CVs have a lot of damage that is not very healable. So on top of setting up these crossfires whenever they want to, a lot of that damage that they deal is not healable, which is torpedoes, AP bombs, AP rockets. Surface ships dealing this damage isn't really a bad thing because it requires smart positioning, it requires a lot of time to set up these crossfires for a surface ship, and catching someone off guard. Whereas CVs are capable of doing this very quickly, like we talked about in the crossfire section. It's unrealistic, I think, to have that level of unhealable damage, as well as the incredibly short amount of time that it takes to get that damage off. So I really believe that this is not a good game mechanic at all. But even if the damage is healable, it takes out your damage control and it takes out your heal, which is critical for killing a ship. That's one of the biggest things that happens in competitive games, let's say. You have to get that damage control and heal out of the way and on cooldown, and then you know the rest of that HP is all you have to go through to kill that ship. Okay? So it's these things a CV can do instantly, whereas surface ships, it takes a lot longer to outmaneuver someone. The other issue, obviously, is spotting for the team to deal damage. A surface ship generally can't spot for itself very easily. Let's say you're in a battleship, you're going to need a destroyer to really spot enemies for you. In a destroyer, if you're spotting, you're likely not gunboating. I know there's gunboats and that kind of thing, but in a very basic scenario, you're just kind of there spotting. Whereas a CV is capable of spotting for itself and then dealing all this massive damage all by itself in a very short amount of time. And I know destroyer torpedoes can deal huge hits all at once as well, and they can spot for themselves. But the main difference there is the amount of time it takes. The CV takes very, very little time to deal these massive strikes that they can spot for themselves, whereas a DD takes a lot of time to set up the perfect torpedo drop. So that's the main difference there. So to get the most out of a surface ship's ammunition, they need to play incredibly smart and position very well and think about these things several minutes in advance from when they're actually going to carry out these massive hits. Whereas a CV simply needs to fly over to a target and approach from the correct angle, so torpedoes on a broadside, dive bombers from the front or the back, and rocket planes, kind of varies. But there's very little thought put into this and very little planning ahead put into this. And because of how fast the planes are, it's just repositioning from one side of the map to the other, wherever you need to be, is incredibly fast compared to surface ships. So this contributes to the player skill difference in surface ships versus CVs. I'm going to talk about this more in depth later, but the reason surface ships are harder to play than CVs, in a large part, is that they take a long time to reposition. And positioning is the biggest factor between an average player and a very good player. So, one last thing to talk about in terms of ammunition. CVs never have to deal with a permanently killed torp or turret because their planes are just constantly regenerating. So they might have smaller squads near the end of the game, but they're never dealing with simply not being able to use their ammunition. Whereas, let's say you kill a turret on some of these new destroyers, like these 2 turret DDs, half of their DPM from their guns is gone permanently, right? A CV doesn't have to deal with this. This isn't necessarily a massive balance issue for CVs. This is more just to say CVs have very little to worry about. There's not very many hard or frustrating parts to playing a CV, whereas surface ships, there's some pretty annoying things. Okay, now let's talk about the CV rework and the difference in CV versus CV gameplay. Obviously, this changed massively, and it basically removed the ability for CVs to fight one another. Previously, to get this damage output from a CV, you had to outplay the enemy CV in some way. even if it was just going to the other side of the map than the enemy CV was paying attention to, it still meant that you had to do something different because of another player in the game. And that's not really in this game anymore. And if you really wanted to go at it against a good CV player, it would be incredibly hard to get damage because of that PvP element. A good CV player could entirely shut down the enemy CV, as well as deal massive damage to the other team. A good CV player was incredibly powerful. Now, a good CV player is still powerful, but they don't have that ability to shut down the enemy CV in this new rework. It's more of just a player versus the computer experience, I guess, PvE kind of thing when it comes to CVs, because there's not really much to stop a CV from getting its strikes off. Sure, there's AA, but that's not a player controlling that. That's just random numbers working in the background to put up flak puffs in a certain way. It's not really much to do there. So it's kind of a massive change. The other thing is, in RTS CVs, you had defensive fire, which spread out a drop to its maximum dispersion, so that these drops would never be entirely accurate. And sure, while it was a frustrating thing to have one button click completely counter your CV strike, it allowed the surface ship to at least have something, some of the time, to deal with the strike. Now there's nothing really there to deal with a CV strike, which is unfortunate, because there was a bit of a metagame in CVs where the CV player had to bait out the defensive fire and pull their attack planes back, wait that 30 to 40 seconds, and then go in and strike, knowing they were free of this defensive fire. So there was this dynamic, complex game there. Whereas now it's just kind of fly in and strike whomever you want to, preferably the loneliest target, because that's going to be the least amount of AA. It's kind of sad, really. Sure, there's the ability to drop fighters, but realistically, that's not going to do much. A CV has to notice who the enemy CV is striking over and over again, and maybe drop some fighters, but then the enemy CV can just go to a different target and just drop that guy. So not really much gameplay there. And you'll see sometimes from bad CV players, they'll try and chase the enemy CV's planes and then drop a fighter. That never works. Like, ever. The fighters take too long to initiate an engagement after they've been called, that it never latches onto the CV. So there's really no gameplay there in the new rework, CV versus CV, which is pretty sad. Now let's talk about CV games versus non-CV games. All this stuff adds up to a very, 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 very passive game. It's really, really bad. Okay, time to talk about CV games versus non-CV games. All the things I've mentioned so far add up to an incredibly passive game. People are punished far more harshly in a CV game for pushing up because they're spotted more and put into crossfires far more often. The people who venture alone on a flank usually get rewarded by flanking the enemy and getting that extra damage out of their AP or their torpedoes, let's say. But that's not possible in a CV game because you're punished the most when you are all alone, because a CV obviously wants to strike the target that's alone because they lose less of their planes. They'll be guaranteed basically multiple drops on the same target, which means more damage with less risk to their planes. This is why a CV game results in everyone camping at their spawn at the back with overlapping AA, because nobody wants to be the guy caught out by CVs. Because, like I mentioned earlier, AA is all a mechanic that is not in your control, it's RNG based, and it doesn't feel good to be outplayed by a in-game mechanic in a PvP game. So you obviously don't want to be in that scenario. So that's why everybody stays at the back in a clump and not doing very much, which results in a very boring game, let's be honest, right? Like, that is not fun to play in at all. Nobody likes to just sit at the back of the map and snipe in a naval action arcade game, I don't think. It's just not very fun. Caps suddenly become a place to stay away from due to incoming CV focus the instant you touch it. Usually it's best to never touch the cap until your team has won that side of the map and everybody pushes through together in their overlapped AA. Playing in a CV game changes the entire way the game is played. One ship, well, 2 ships in an entire game of 24 people changes the way everybody else has to play the game. That's crazy. And if it hasn't been clear, it doesn't change it in a good way. It makes the game less dynamic, less interesting, less about positioning and flanking, more about just sniping at the back and just playing a very boring, stale, passive game. As stated earlier, CV spotting trivializes information gathering. There's very little risk in a CV game to learn where the enemy team is deploying, which is incredibly valuable as it allows you to react and reposition to deal with the largest threats sooner. In a non-CV game, this critical information requires risking a ship to gain, and it's possible the enemy team can surprise you with their deployment, which is no longer possible in a CV game, where the whole enemy team can be spotted in 2 minutes. And I can confidently say, a large part of competitive when there's no CV is information gathering and reacting to where the enemy is deploying, while also implementing your own plans as well. So, CVs change the way you have to play every single class in the game. So, destroyers, obviously you got to play way more passive because you are unable to rely on your concealment. You don't have very good AA, so you can't venture alone anywhere. You have to be close-ish to the enemy team, or your team, sorry, for that AA support. It removes flanking routes, and it removes complexity from the DD gameplay experience. You can't contest caps. This tells the CV exactly where you are, and basically guarantees the CV is going to be coming after you. The solution is to stick with your teammates and try and support them with guns, smoke, torps, but never venture out alone. Cruisers, you also somewhat rely on concealment, and that's no longer possible with a CV in the game. Hiding behind islands and spamming over them is far more dangerous, because a CV could spot you at any time, and a battleship could take a long-range shot over the island, or the CV could just come in with AP bombs or rockets and just devastating strike you, due to your low speed and inability to dodge when you're spamming from behind an island. The solution here is to remain at speed so you can dodge the CV drops and be near your teammates to support them with AA. Probably at the back of the map, let's be honest. Battleships cannot rely on armor. Pointing your bow towards the enemy is usually a good idea in a CV game, as you're tankiest when you're angled. But going bow in when CVs are present makes you a perfect target for this CV to set up a crossfire that you cannot dodge, that is likely going to deal damage that you can't really heal back, which is a large part of the damage battleships take. They want to take healable damage, so they can, be a good tank for their team for longer periods of time. The solution? Sit near the back and snipe, preferably in a group of overlapping AA, far enough away that you can maneuver to attempt to dodge the strike without the enemy team killing you when you give broadside while dodging that strike. So, the solution, as you'll notice, is to sit near the back of the map and snipe. Pretty boring, in my opinion. Now I want to talk briefly about World of Tanks artillery and comparing CVs to that. I will say I've never played World of Tanks, but I've definitely heard about how much artillery is hated and how unfair it feels to fight against. The artillery, similar to CVs, doesn't risk his HP to deal this damage. But the difference I see here, as someone who hasn't played artillery, or played against it, sorry, is that artillery can't spot for itself, and it can't overshoot over tall buildings and cover. But CVs, aircraft, don't have this limitation at all. They can go wherever they want to, getting around islands, going over islands, all that stuff. They can spot for themselves, removing both of the limitations of artillery. This is like, in my mind, it seems like artillery on steroids, giving it all the power in the world. Now, artillery shells aren't subject to AA, which is fair. They can shoot them down. But the thing is, AA, as currently implemented, is designed to allow the carrier to get at least one drop, even in concentrated AA clusters. So I don't really see that making CVs that much more balanced than artillery. In fact, I think CVs are far worse for balance than artillery, from a very high level. So let's talk about player skill difference for just a little bit. The reason you will often see people who aren't very good in surface ships be decent to very good in aircraft carriers is due to positioning in a surface ship requiring a lot of time, okay? So a very, very good player and a average player will probably have similar thoughts on what they need to do, but at very, very different times. The good player will know what they need to do several minutes to maybe even like 10 minutes in advance of where they are now. Whereas a kind of average player will have the same thought minutes later and likely will be too late to impact the battle as much. But CVs and their ability to reposition so quickly removes this skill difference from the game. And that's why you'll see people who struggle in surface ships actually be fine in CVs, because the repositioning and the forethought and all that skill and practice that it takes to be good in a surface ship is just simply not there in a CV. This is why I don't really take it seriously when people say CVs are fine that have mediocre stats in surface ships but are very good in CVs, because of course they want CVs to stay where they are. It's a shortcut to being a good player. They don't have to do all that work of thinking ahead and getting a lot of practice in the game to know what they should be doing minutes before they're doing it. And the other problem I have with it is their arguments usually boil down to, it's fine because I'm good at it. So I don't really like that either. It is human nature, after all, to take the path of least resistance. And I'm not saying this just applies to CVs. This applies to ships like Smolensk that are obviously not balanced, or Thunder too. That's why you see so many of them. They're easy. They make the game less complicated to play and gives you the ability to impact the game at a very high level without putting all that work into it. So I did run this past some of my clanmates, which I'm in 07 if you didn't know, and they had a few thoughts on the matter too. They thought I did a reasonable job of putting this together. But one thing they did bring up is that you could also say CVs largely ignore a target's skill level. A 45% win rate player presses the same two buttons as a 65% win rate player, which means each drop is mainly determined by the CV's ability to beat a preset difficulty. That's why some mediocre ship players are suddenly really good at CVs. Suddenly, they don't have to outthink their opponents, they just need to beat the AA system. So, again, it just neutralizes a lot of the differences in player skill. It brings up the skill floor dramatically. Now this one's gonna probably get me in a little bit of hot water, and I'm sure there's gonna be a lot of you listening that really, really dislike me for saying this, but I do have to say it. And this is gonna be how CV players play their class. Up until this point, we've talked about facts and how CVs actually are to play. Now this is gonna be talking more about how players tend to play the ship and use all these mechanics. The ability to go anywhere on the map and strike anyone at any time allows you to focus on one specific player like no other ship in the game. Due to applications like Matchmaking Monitor, or just being generally aware of the top clans and players, gives the CV ability to focus on the best players in the match to potentially give their team an edge to win the game. This isn't always the case, because CVs often take this to the extreme and will focus a particular player even to the detriment of his team winning the game. This creates an incredibly frustrating experience for the player getting focused, and for that CV player doing the focusing, his team, because he is losing that game to focus on someone who's potentially not impacting the result of the battle in that moment of time, where they could be striking targets more important for taking caps and map control and actually winning the game. I'll use a personal example. I've been running away and are potentially nearly at the back of the map, at the border, sometimes even behind my CV, and the enemy CV will continue to strike me until I'm dead, while my team is winning the other flank and winning the game, killing the enemy DDs, taking map control, all of this stuff. And clearly, the enemy CV was not focused on actually winning the game, but he was focused on focusing on one person until they were dead. And this is incredibly frustrating for especially the person getting focused, because, like we said, there's no real skill involved in that fight for the surface ship player. It's just RNG, and an automated AA system. But the other big issue is there's no running away from this type of focus. CVs don't have a limited range or ability to spot like other surface ships, so a player who's prone to focusing on someone but is playing a surface ship is far less frustrating to play against, because you can always go to the other side of the map or leave their range or get undetected or put an island in between you and that player. When this player is in a CV, there is no escape. Something like the World of Tanks Anonymizer would almost kill this kind of behavior overnight, because that removes player names, that removes clan tags, and that removes the ability to see people's stats. This would be a great change for anyone with probably a blue PR or higher, and anyone like YouTubers or streamers who are prone to getting focused just for their name and not necessarily for their stats. Now, an argument a lot of people make is the realism argument, but I really dislike that argument for CVs being in the game, or at least in the way they are, because this is obviously an arcade game. There are HP bars on ships, right? Obviously that wasn't real. There's no module or crew damage. Well, there's a bit of module damage, but crew damage, like in, say, War Thunder, for example. And I think if you're looking for more of that realistic thing, you should be looking for a game without HP bars. And War Thunder might be that kind of thing for you. But the whole point of an arcade-style game is to make it fun and balanced for everyone to play, and in this case, in a PvP environment. Gameplay should come first, realism should come second, in an arcade game. For example, there's arcade racing games like Need for Speed that are incredibly fun, but probably not very realistic, right? Now you might be thinking to yourself, this is mainly based on personal experience, this isn't really real. Sure, you're a good player, but you don't really know what you're talking about, you're just biased because you hate CVs. Well, let's take a look at what Wargaming has to say, shall we? At the CC Summit, which happened I think a year and a bit ago, Wargaming showed off charts on how CVs are actually performing. The so-called spreadsheet. They show CVs are by far the most battle-efficient class and the highest damage class in the game. Outside of CVs, destroyers are the most battle-efficient, but they also have the lowest average damage. There's a trade-off there. Battleships have the highest average damage outside of CVs, but they have the lowest battle efficiency, with cruisers somewhere in the middle. There's trade-offs here. The problem is, CVs don't have those trade-offs. They're just the most battle efficient and deal the most damage. And have all these unfun, unbalanced, automated mechanics like we talked about earlier. The problem shown at this summit is that the CV rework success is entirely measured on the number of people playing the class. So, as long as more people are playing the reworked CVs than the old RTS CVs, it's considered a success. This is a gigantic problem because it incentivized Wargaming to make reworked CVs incredibly easy to play and incredibly overpowered to encourage more people to play them. And their entire goal is to keep the number of players in the new CVs looking good compared to old RTS CVs. But in these charts, we can also see Wargaming implemented some nerfs to the CVs after release, which is good. But we also see the CV population decrease proportional to these nerfs. So, this is the primary reason CVs are just never going to be balanced. They are by far the best battle-efficient class and damage-dealing class, yet there are barely more people playing it than old RTS CVs. This is the main problem I have with Wargaming at the moment. They know CVs aren't balanced, but they're unwilling to change them because it would mean admitting their rework failed. It seems to me they're unwilling to admit their mistakes. Now, let's talk about some solutions. I don't want to just complain about this game. I do actually like playing it. There are just some mechanics that are so incredibly frustrating that make zero sense to me from making a good, fun, balanced game perspective that I just feel like I have to complain about them. The biggest problem I have with these CVs is the lack of PvP engagement in a PvP game. Simply allowing me to control my AA guns, for example, making it a skill-based experience if I take damage from the CV or not, would go a long way in me feeling better about having CVs in the game. This change would also have to include a buff to CVs, giving them basically unlimited planes, because if you give me the ability as a surface ship to shoot down an entire squad before he drops me, then you obviously need to give the CV lots of chances to get those drops off. But this would also have to nerf CVs so that they can't just have these unlimited planes to constantly be spotting DDs. Now, I'm not a game developer, I haven't fleshed this idea out, but that is my best idea using the current framework of how CVs function in mind. The other idea I've had is to simply improve CVs is to make all the damage they deal 100% healable. This is one of the most frustrating parts about the damage specifically that CVs deal, is that it's often not healable. So giving me the ability to heal it back if I manage to survive would go a long way in helping me feel a little bit better about this damage that is being done to my ship. And the last idea I have is to change CVs into a support class, which this one, I'll admit, is not very fleshed out at all and would require massive changes. But what if you had CVs dropping smokes, heals, damage controls for their teammates, similar to, I don't know, how some scenarios worked, where there's healing locations, or maybe like Arms Race, where there's different buffs that CVs could drop at different times that last a short amount of time. It's a very rough idea, but it would keep CVs in the game, make the game more dynamic, and remove the frustrating fly anywhere, deal massive damage that's unhealable, that there's no player versus player interaction. In conclusion, this video is why I believe CVs don't belong in the game in their current state. I'd be fine with CVs being in the game if they were healthy for the game, but I fundamentally believe they are not. And I believe in their current state, they fundamentally break the gameplay loop at a very basic level, all the way to the more complex damage dealing stuff as well. They make this thinking man's action game have very, very little action. And as a final note that I would like to say, the most successful wargaming tournament internationally, the Verizon Championship, intentionally left CVs out, likely because they realized how much worse the game would be with CVs in it. Thank you for listening to my rant and all the points I have. I'd encourage everybody to be civil. Obviously, it's just a video game. Don't attack people personally over this kind of stuff, but these are my thoughts on it. And again, a reminder, if you want to argue against my points, you have to show significant evidence that you have experience at a high level, if you even want to hope to change my mind. So, thanks for watching, guys, and I hope you have a great day.